Listen well to the tale of the Rotskin King and his darksome court. From the weft and weave of war he came, claws a-scrabbling over fallow fields thick with crawling flies and milky-eyed dead. Alongside the fine king, his lordly courtiers did prance, scenting the air from morbid smells. Pale of skin and wild of eyes were they, seeking out the promise of riches to be had. They danced a jaunty path through the grave-digger's garden. What blade and axe had planted, hungry claws harvested for their king and his subjects. The foolish and the desperate heeded the Dark King's call, starving wretches eager to sell their souls, impatient for a chance to partake of the king's table of fleshly morsels. For a full belly they came, their minds already embracing the king's badness, if only to live a day longer. Maybe they knew and maybe not, but to take even a bite from the creature's plate was to be forever damned. Where once stood fair and honest peoples, there now were servants of the Rotskin King. Reason, like a setting sun, faded from their eyes, replaced with an endless night of madness. And so the court grew and grew, its hissing, cackling courtiers herding a tide of fresh-made ghouls. Those who sought to thwart or hide from them met the same fate. All were overwhelmed by the frenzied cannibals caught up in the delusion of their master.
Hello friends, today we're going to be doing our first Age of Sigmar lore video, and today we're going to be exploring the Flesh Eater Courts, if you haven't already figured that out from our intro. To really get an understanding of the Flesh Eater Courts, we really have to go back in time to the Age of Myth. See, once upon a time there was a beautiful vampire who was very regal, renowned throughout the land for being fair and just, and at some point this vampire crossed Nagash. Now, Nagash, as we all know, does not take slights very well, so he went ahead and put a curse on this vampire that made him ugly and pallid. His hair fell out, he became a monstrosity, and just a shadow of his former self. Now, as you can imagine, to someone whose appearances mean a lot to them, this is pretty devastating, and so this vampire went on a rampage and rebelled against Nagash. He lit Nagash's cities on fire, pillaged the land of the dead. Well, Nagash, wanting to get some justice back at him, took this vampire, he captured him, and he threw him in a prison that is pretty interesting. Essentially, it's a prison that reflects lies back at you. So you can imagine being a hideous monster who's angry, trapped in a prison that drives you insane for an indeterminate amount of time. You can imagine the effects are pretty bad on you. And really all we know is that he would have stayed there pretty much for forever had, during the Age of Chaos, or the early parts of it, Nagash betrayed Sigmar. Sigmar got ticked and came down to pick a fight with Nagash himself. Well, during that turmoil, he accidentally let loose what we now know as the Carrion King, that original vampire. This vampire then set out to start his court anew. Now there's something very different about him now. He's not the vampire that went into the cage. He is infected and just obliterated by this madness, this insanity that was thrust upon him by the cage in which he was being held in. The madness is simply that he perceives himself to be that same noble, regal, beautiful vampire that he was before any of this ever began. So now when he starts his vampire court, by collecting followers and just doing what vampires do, multiplying, having servants, things like that, they're all becoming infected with that same madness. They get infected and they perceive this hideous, grotesque vampire to be the normal, regal king that he thinks he is. So there's this shared madness. It's not just that they're all crazy, babbling psychopaths, that they have the same coherent vision running through them. And like all forces, they just multiply. The court grew until some of the older ones split off, started their own, and then just kept going, multiplying over the Age of Chaos. And all of a sudden the Flesh Eater courts are spread pretty much all throughout the realms and have numbers that are fairly vast. So now we have some groundwork. Let's talk about how a particular Flesh Eater court grows. Let's just pick one. Essentially, throughout the Immortal Realms, there's a collection of desperate people. The Age of Chaos just destroyed so many civilizations. There's a lot of refugees. survivors everywhere. And when things get really, really bad, a lot of these people have no choice but to turn towards cannibalism. There's something about being in that impossible situation that calls out to what is called an Arborant Ghoul King. Now, these are vampires that are infected with the madness of the Carrion King. So they're not beautiful, like Neferata, nothing like that. These are the grizzled, ugly monsters created from that original vampire's lineage. Well, they feel this presence of this dire situation of people being desperate beyond measure, and they're drawn to it. Now, when this vampire approaches these survivors and these desperate people, he offers them a feast. Now, maybe some of them understand that afterwards they're going to have to work for him. I think few would understand the implications, because when you actually eat the food that the vampire offers you, you become instantly a part of that madness. Meaning, where once you were a ragged refugee who was struggling for survival and this hideous, grotesque monster offers you food, you take a bite of it and all of a sudden the world turns super rose-tinted and you see yourself as a humble peasant with a good life, and sitting before you is a beautiful king ready to lead you onward and upward to victory. And so that's how the Flesh Eater courts began at the lowest level. They take people and absorb them in, people who are desperate beyond measure, who are struggling to survive, bring them into the madness, and then from there, things get really interesting. See, everyone starts off as a crypt ghoul. That's the most basic level that you can imagine. But there's a few levels above it. So if you get a sample of the vampire's blood, usually of your Flesh Eater Court King's blood, you become what's called a crypt horror. So these are much bigger monstrosity, lumbering cousins of the crypt ghoul. If you get a sample of the king's blood and a bit of the, say, like a terrorgeist flesh, then you become an even different monstrosity called a crypt flayer. These are the winged ones who act as the scouts and vanguard. It's important to remember that this madness theme is throughout the entire battletome. So all of these people see themselves as heroic knights. I imagine it's kind of like how Bretonnia was back in the old edition of Warhammer, where it's very medieval timesy. So like I said, your crypt ghouls see themselves as peasant militia maybe. Your crypt horrors might see themselves as knights. Flayers maybe as scouts or a vanguard unit. Everyone perceives zombie dragons and terrorgeists as griffins and beautiful dragons, the ones that aren't dead. Everyone also sees the Arborant Ghoul King as their savior, their hope, a very regal man clad in gold. I want to take just a moment and talk here about the madness itself. Now here's the interesting thing. The book does a really great job of splitting reality from the perception. By that I mean there's a lot of references to what the enemy is looking at versus what the Flesh Eater courts themselves are thinking that they're doing. So take, for example, they're fighting I believe it's a Khorne warband at one point. The story starts off with a Ghoul King who is given a very official report that his people are hungry, they're scavenging for food. He takes his mantle of leadership very seriously as he looks upon his hardened men that have been with him through thick and thin. Very heroic stuff. And then he sees some provisions that are being guarded by the evil guys. Well, this is, of course, in reality, it's a whole bunch of hungry flesh eaters just kind of mulling around trying to eat anything they can, including bugs, people, each other, whatever. And then they see a Khorne warband, and they perceive those people as being the provision. So, of course, the king, understanding the risks, goes ahead and summons his court. They all go to battle. Kind of the camera, if you can imagine that, then pans over to the Chaos guys who all they're seeing is they're fine until all of a sudden these very pallid, sickly, nasty people start pouring out of the woods to come eat them. As they're being torn down, they're getting eaten alive. Knights perceive that there's a leader out there, so they go charging into it, and it's a guy riding a zombie dragon. It's just absolute chaos on their end. But of course, from the Flesh Eater Court's perspective, this is all sound battle doctrine and tactics, and it's all been measured and weighed because that's how you conduct yourself in war. So there's a great bit of fluff freedom if you're a Flesh Eaters player, where you can make these narratives where you're always the hero, even though you're always the bad guy. The last little thing I want to touch on before we end this first segment is how the Flesh Eater courts view Nagash himself. And this is actually one of the things about the fluff that I have found incredibly interesting, is there's kind of a schism. Some of them perceive him to be essentially God. It makes sense. They're all creatures who are infused and eat, sleep, and breathe death magic. So that kind of makes sense. Tabletop-wise, he doesn't really interact with them particularly well. He does okay, same as he does everyone else. However, the other half sees him as a traitor, which is very interesting. To perceive the Lord of Death as a traitor to you and your lineage, because some people seem to have this understanding of what Nagash did to their progeny, or their lineage, I should say, and others don't seem to have that at all. So it's very interesting as the Flesh Eater courts have grown and expanded the very different viewpoints and motivations they can have for even interacting with things from their own Grand Alliance. So to summarize, the Flesh Eater courts are an amazing faction in the game. They have a wide variety of tactics they can use to achieve things in the battlefield. They also have this incredibly interesting theme of madness that gives a really fun perception versus reality aspect to narrative gaming on the tabletop. If you'd like to learn more about the Flesh Eater Courts starter set, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the faction, at all, go ahead and click the link in the description. That'll bring you to 2+ Tough website where they have a review of each start collecting box. If you like this video and want to see more Age of Sigmar lore, click subscribe and put it in the comments below. Thank you guys. Happy wargaming.